So let's talk about this 10-point plan from the National Association of Builders. 10 points are: number one, eliminate excessive regulations; number two, promote careers in the skilled trades; number three, fix building material supply chains and ease costs; number four, pass federal tax legislation to expand the production of affordable and attainable housing; five, overturn inefficient local zoning rules; six, alleviate permitting roadblocks; seven, adopt reasonable and cost-effective building codes; eight, reduce local impact fees and other upfront taxes associated with housing construction; nine, make it easier for developers to finance new housing; and 10, update employment policies to promote flexibility and opportunity. Let's just take it right off the top with number one, this idea of eliminating excessive regulation. What do you know about excessive regulation and how that contributes to housing costs, GC?
I see a lot of it. I see our housing costs have increased dramatically, both on the development side and on the home building side. And so we see it firsthand. And I wanted to spend some time sharing this 10-point plan from the National Association of Home Builders, because some of you who are listening may be saying, all right, Greg, well, you've done a pretty good job of painting both sides of the equation when it comes to things like immigration or tariffs or whatnot. That really is my goal here. So those are hot button items. But you might be saying, well, what do you think? What do you really think the plan is? And where do you guys stand behind at JWB? And this 10-point plan largely outlines the initiatives that JWB believes would have the biggest impact to improve our housing affordability. And the first one is there for a reason. According to the National Association of Home Builders, 25% of the cost to build one single family home and 40% of the cost to build an apartment is due to regulatory costs. So we need to have the right amount of regulation, but burdening a home by 25% or maybe 40% due to regulation seems like an opportunity for us to decrease the cost of housing, to build it, which in theory and in actuality would dramatically lead to more home price affordability. And to put some numbers to it, according to the National Association of Home Builders and the studies they put together, $31,000 of cost in a house comes from these regulations. That's 31 grand. You know, houses in Jacksonville we sell for, call it around 250,000. I mean, that's a lot of opportunity for us to sharpen the pencil and make a really dramatic impact for Americans.
It sounds like we're talking there as far as like bringing homes to market and reducing kind of like the supply constraints to a certain extent. If we are talking about cost of home ownership and we were to eliminate a bunch of regulations, is there a case that could be made that may or may not even out in cost of actual home ownership? Like if we reduce regulations, could that also maybe increase maintenance on the back end or even increase insurance, because insurance now feels like there's kind of like less regulations, so now they gotta price that in or something like that? Would that be a fair thing to ponder?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was going on in my mind. I was like, the idea of reducing regulations and saving 31 grand, sure, that sounds great, but what are you giving up?
Yeah.
So there's an example here that I did some research and I found that I think accentuates the opportunity to sharpen the pencil a little bit.
Mhm.
And so a recent study, and this was done by the Home Builders Association of Greater Kansas City, and this is that same study that found that the cost, it's an additional $31,000 of additional cost due to regulation to build one single family home. According to their study, it would require up to 90. So they also looked at the savings, like the energy efficiency savings that are being required. And they ran the study for the energy efficiency savings. And they said, basically, it's just a little bit of an energy efficiency savings. Like, according to them, the homes that we are building now have been improved so much over the years that the net savings is really small. And according to their study, it would take up to 90 years for a home buyer who would be receiving that a little bit of energy savings to recoup the cost of the $31,000 of additional cost. So they're looking at it from the lens of the end buyer, who may or may not know that they're actually being burdened by these costs. And they're looking at, what's the payback? What's the return on investment there? And 90 years sounds like a lot to me. So this is not a push that I have or that JWB has that we should eliminate all regulation. We should just take a deep dive and look at it. Look at what is the return on investment for the end home buyer here. And I do believe that there's a lot of opportunities for us to be thoughtful and prudent about this. And ultimately, reduce the cost to build a house, because if you reduce the cost to build a house, what you're doing is you're lowering the future price gains in real estate, the future cost increases. We have certainly seen how cost increases have been a contributing factor to home prices going up over the last 4 years. And if we continue to have excessive, costly regulation that doesn't really put money in the pockets of our home buyers, then we're not on the fastest track to home price affordability.
That's really cool. That's really good to hear. The fact that this has been studied, that this can be really like a big win, and that there is real meat on the bone there to cut, man. Like that makes me pretty optimistic. Points 2 and 3, promoting skills in the trades. That doesn't really feel kind of like within what we're talking about right now. Material supply, chains that, we can talk about that with tariffs, but we pretty much beat that up. 4, passing federal tax legislation to expand the production of affordable and attainable housing. GC, what do you think about this?
Man, I love this. I love this. So this is a program that we know here in Jacksonville. It's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And it's a great program. And the thing about it is people generally know that it works. It works because what it does is it incentivizes developers and investors to invest in missing middle housing. Missing middle is the type of housing that we need in our workforce housing neighborhoods. That might be townhomes, it might be duplexes, triplexes, quads, apartments, right? Missing middle housing is a big need. And so these low-income housing tax credits allow us to do that. They work. Everybody sort of agrees that they work. The problem is there's just not enough funding there. And the reason that they work for everybody here, not just developers and investors, is because in order to do one of these deals as a developer, you have to commit to keeping your rents at affordable levels for a certain period of time, maybe 10 years, 15 years, or maybe even up to 40 years. And so you are securing affordable rents in the market for these developments. So we've got a model that works. There's just not nearly enough funding. For JWB, if there was more funding out there to do things like this, we could do 10 of these a year in essence right now. And right now we're working on our very first one at the moment. But from an ability to perform it, there's nothing holding us back. It's the funding. It's the funding that is holding it back. So expanding and passing legislation to expand those types of incentive programs, I think, is a wonderful opportunity for our country.
That sounds awesome. All right, number 5. Speaking of things that we like to shout about, overturning inefficient local zoning rules. I feel like this is one that we can all really get behind, right? This idea of like, hey, low hanging fruit here is to increase density, change these like inefficient land use policies, reduce the need for parking in a world where autonomous vehicles are taking over and all this type of stuff. What do you think about this one, GC?
Man, this just seems like something that's in our locus of control. It is something
Yeah.
that we can control and that can lead to very large gains in supply. And especially in Jacksonville, I think it matters even more here because as a city, we have a lot of land. We are not densely populated like other cities. So when we're thinking about the supply solution here, that means that we have more of an opportunity here. If we can change some of our inefficient zoning rules to allow for more density, we can build, twice as many units on the same given land, or maybe more than that. And ultimately, if we keep our focus on supply is the problem, this is something that can have a large effect. So things that you can do, again, talking about expanding missing middle housing like townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, things like that, but then also reducing parking requirements, reducing other variance requirements that limit the amount of units that you can build on a piece of land. And it's within our control. I think a lot of this comes down to communities and neighborhoods being open to it. There is a lot of what's called NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard-ism. And, if I'm just speaking for the general populations, we as a general population across this country are resistant to missing middle housing. That's the reason why it hasn't been done more. And that NIMBYism is sort of protected by antiquated zoning codes. You go to other countries, you don't see the same type of layouts of housing that you see in our country. So if we can evolve a little bit and the zoning codes can follow that evolution of us being open to more density, millions of Americans are going to benefit from this.
Let's hit on a couple more things here, GC. Number 7, adopt reasonable and cost-effective building codes. I know that you highlighted this one as something that you wanted to talk about. You want to give your take on that?
Yeah, it's that's where that example came from that I shared with you of the minimal cost savings that these housing codes are requiring are just not having the payback that we have. And
Yeah.
a lot of these housing codes have been really wonderful over, call it, the last couple of decades to get us to a place where we have, such energy efficiency in the homes and whatnot. So the question really is it worth now to burden a new homeowner, call it $31,000 for a single family home, to get this amount of cost savings on a monthly basis or an annual basis? And so there's a lot of examples like that. So these specific housing codes can be analyzed from a return on investment perspective and say, are we doing what we set out to do, or are we causing more damage by this costly of a housing code that does not have that much of an impact, right? I think we are all about energy efficiency and costs to put into something if there is a big return on that investment to the end homeowner, because ultimately what that does is it improves housing affordability. I think what we're talking about here is improving those codes that do the opposite. And that example of it taking 90 years to get a payback would be an example of one of those.
At the end of the day, the single family home asset class has just kind of like less volatility. What do you think about that, GC?
I'll just jump on the last point. I do think there's certainly merit to what you're talking about. I think a lot of it comes down to it's supply and demand. So how much concentration is in your marketplace when it
Yeah.
comes to government jobs might be something to take into account. But I'm just going to jump on the last thing you said. Is we continue to show risk factors in the commercial real estate world or in the apartment world that we just don't have in the single family world. I mean, at the end of the day, the government put an executive order together to talk about putting plans together to make sure that housing costs don't continue to go up so much, right? It's not like they're doing that on the commercial side, right? And then again, if thinking about it as an investor, just keeping it really simple, you want to be owning something that there's not a lot of supply of that a lot of people want, right? If the government understands that affordable housing is so important, and they thought it was so important that in the first week of office for them to say, hey, listen, I want to see stuff put together so that the costs don't continue to rise at the same level. Like, that just means it's a good asset to buy and hold, right? And you don't see this type of intervention on the commercial real estate side, So again, I just like to keep it really simple, guys. Buy something that there is something in short supply and that a lot of people want. Single family rental properties fit that bill.
I think that's a pretty good way to end this, right? Like this idea of like, hey, we may feel like we're in like this chaotic world. At the end of the day, let's go back to first principles. The reason why all this stuff, why there's such an elevated conversation around the housing supply is because it is in low supply and high demand. There is a lot of work to be done to stop this idea that housing prices are going up at like a ridiculous rate. And at the end of the day, as real estate investors, holding that asset that sits there is an asset in good position when everything else feels really, really turbulent. And, and it's so decentralized that for it to create a giant dent in it has to have so much effort from so many different moving tentacles that are so hard to put together. It makes me as a real estate investor feel pretty good about the idea that, like my approach to building wealth is essentially a 60-40 portfolio, but that 60 is single family rental homes in growing markets and like investing in these like workforce housing that's chronically undersupplied and always going to be demanded. It's just kind of like the zoom out perspective. Anything there, GC?
Love the way you break it down, brother. I think, it's just you have this beautiful asset sitting right under our noses, and you can do it in a way where everybody wins. The resident wins, our country wins, you win. And it's right here. It's right outside our doors right now. Single family homes.